Thus saith the Lord. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?
Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive deep into the fascinating and honestly highly debated case of Pharaoh. Today, we are systematically examining the actual evidence behind his infamous choices. Now, you might be thinking you already know the story backward and forward, right? We've got ancient plagues, we've got miraculous escapes, and of course, a remarkably stubborn king. But today, we're going to look at this narrative through a very focused, investigative lens. We're going to pull it apart and uncover the true anatomy of a hardened heart.
To keep things completely organized and easy to follow, we are treating this just like a legal docket. Here's our agenda. Part 1, the Pharaoh dilemma. Part 2, pride before the fall. Part 3, building the legal case. Part 4, the verdict, judicial hardening. And finally, Part 5, a mirror for modern society.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Pharaoh dilemma. It's time to confront the central charge that is so often leveled at this biblical narrative.
So, here's the big question. Did God arbitrarily force Pharaoh to sin? For centuries, critics have loved to argue that Pharaoh was basically just an innocent puppet, a tragic victim of divine manipulation, someone whose rebellion was manufactured solely so God could show off his power on the world stage. They ask, did the Creator simply force evil into a totally unwilling man's heart? Well, as we dive into the actual evidence, our investigation reveals that this interpretation completely misses the mark, like not even close.
To really understand this case, we have to establish a non-negotiable baseline rule right out of the gate. And we find that rule right here in the book of James. It says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." This is absolutely crucial. The Creator does not manufacture pride. He does not implant wickedness into a human heart. And he certainly doesn't coerce a righteous man into wicked rebellion. Therefore, logically and theologically, Pharaoh's hardness could not have started because God tempted him to do evil. As we build our case today, this is the legal precedent that governs absolutely everything else we're going to talk about.
And that brings us smoothly into Section 2, pride before the fall. Now that we have our baseline rule firmly in place, we have to ask the obvious question.
Where did his resistance actually originate? I mean, every good investigation looks for a motive, right? Well, when Moses first approaches him, Pharaoh's response isn't one of innocent curiosity. He doesn't say, "Oh, tell me more." He literally asks, "Who is the Lord?" And he does this to actively reject obedience. You have to remember, Pharaoh stood within a culture that treated kingship as divine. He was a living God to his people. So he wasn't defending truth here. He was defending his own supreme status. The God of Israel confronted him as the true sovereign over creation, and Pharaoh's immediate aggressive response was basically, "No way. I recognize absolutely no authority above myself."
It's exactly as the famous proverb warns, "Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall." You see, Pharaoh's root problem was never a lack of evidence. It wasn't that Moses lacked the proper credentials or didn't perform enough miracles. The plagues were undeniable, literally overwhelming displays of power over the Nile, the sky, the land, you name it. But a haughty spirit simply cannot tolerate a higher throne. Pharaoh's hardness began right here, locally, internally, in his own radical self-exaltation.
So the takeaway here is that yielding to Moses meant Pharaoh would have to surrender his deeply held illusion of total control over Egypt. This wasn't just some standard political negotiation over a labor force. It was profoundly theological, and it was deeply personal. Every single plague systematically exposed another false security, breaking down the false gods of Egypt one by one. But instead of letting go of his illusion of control, what does Pharaoh do? He tightens his grip. He consistently chooses his own self-preservation over obedience and his public image over undeniable truth.
Let's move on to Section 3, building the legal case. Because we aren't just looking at one isolated incident of a guy being stubborn on a Tuesday. We're looking at a documented, escalating sequence of events. Proverbs 29 provides the perfect legal framework for our investigation, showing us exactly how a heart becomes permanently hardened in 3 very deliberate steps. Step 1. Repeated reproof. God didn't just strike Egypt out of nowhere without warning. Moses and Aaron came repeatedly, offering opportunity after opportunity for Pharaoh to humble himself. Step 2. Willful resistance. This is what the text calls the hardening of the neck, a deliberate, conscious refusal to bend to authority. And finally, step 3. Sudden destruction without remedy. The final collapse of his empire might look sudden to an outsider, but make no mistake, the moral decay leading up to it was incredibly gradual.
Now, what is truly devastating to Pharaoh's defense is the sheer volume of internal witnesses. In any court case, witness testimony is paramount, right? Pharaoh couldn't claim ignorance because his own religious specialists, his own inner circle, came to him and confessed, "This is the finger of God." Even his own servants eventually pleaded with him, saying, "Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed?" These internal witnesses completely strip away any defense that Pharaoh lacked sufficient warning or clarity on the situation. Furthermore, the ensuing plagues weren't just random natural disasters. They were highly targeted judgments systematically dismantling Egypt's false gods and Pharaoh's illusion of absolute control. Just look at these symbols. The Nile, the livestock, the weather, every single one represents something the Egyptians worshipped or trusted in for their security. The Nile was thought to be a divine source of life. God turned it to blood. They worshipped the sun. God brought pitch darkness. You see, Pharaoh's resistance stood right at the intersection of idolatry and pride. He wasn't valiantly defending truth against some oppressor. He was frantically trying to defend a collapsing illusion that he was the ultimate power in the universe. Each plague exposed another false security, and each warning offered yet another chance to surrender.
To really understand the anatomy of his defiance, we need to look at the original Hebrew vocabulary used to describe his heart. The biblical narrative is fascinating because it doesn't just use one word, it uses a specific combination of terms that paint a rather terrifying picture. First, there's hazak, which shows a man actively strengthening his own resolve against God. Then there's kabed, implying a heart made heavy by its own immense pride. And finally, kasha, which shows a severe, unbending stiffness. Taken together, these aren't passive words. They document a king who is systematically, actively reinforcing his own rebellion.
And here is the absolute smoking gun of our investigation. Exodus 8:15 explicitly tells us that whenever God showed mercy and lifted a plague, Pharaoh used that respite to actively renew his rebellion. Think about that. Mercy did not soften him. Relief did not reform him. Instead, he weaponized the grace of breathing room to stiffen his neck all over again. He repeatedly strengthened himself against God long before God ever stepped in to issue a final judicial sentence. Which brings us to Section 4, the verdict, judicial hardening. Having clearly established the motive, the opportunity, and the repeated offenses, we finally arrive at the judgment phase. What happens when divine patience reaches its righteous limit?
It is only after a long, well-documented sequence of deliberate personal resistance that the text shifts. We finally reach Exodus 9:12, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Context here is literally everything. By the time we hit this specific verse, Pharaoh has already rejected commands, he has broken promises right after pleading for relief, and he has actively hardened his own heart multiple times. So this isn't the beginning of the story. This is the definitive judicial response to a rebellion that Pharaoh had already fiercely maintained.
So I have to ask, what exactly is this judicial action? Well, God didn't implant wickedness. He righteously removed the restraints. This hardening was confirmatory. God simply handed Pharaoh over to the very desires he had been relentlessly pursuing. It's kind of like removing the guardrails on a dangerous mountain road that Pharaoh was already actively speeding down. It was a sovereign act of justice, entirely consistent with a God of absolute holiness.
And as the analysis points out from Romans chapter 9, God utilized this massive public stage to shatter Egypt's illusions and demonstrate absolute, supreme authority. God did not for 1 second lose control when Pharaoh rebelled. Instead, he sovereignly ruled over that guilt. He used Pharaoh's extreme stubbornness to globally display his own name, completely dismantle the Egyptian false gods, and ultimately secure the liberation of his people. No earthly king can successfully contend with the Creator, and Pharaoh's judgment proved it to the entire world.
This event was so profound that even centuries later, the Philistine priests viewed the Exodus as a dire historical warning. And this is key. They didn't look back and say, "Oh, poor Pharaoh, God forced him to do it." No, they recognized that the Egyptians hardened their own hearts. The Philistine counselors used this exact history as a terrifying warning to their own people. The message was clear. Do not repeat the crime of Egypt. Do not look undeniable truth in the face and still refuse to yield.
Let's transition to our final section, a mirror for modern society. Because, as it turns out, this isn't just ancient history. The spirit of Pharaoh is deeply embedded in the attitudes of our contemporary world.
The names, the technology, the everyday vocabulary, sure, all of that has changed, but the human heart condition remains exactly the same. Human autonomy today still treats absolute truth as highly inconvenient, and moral accountability as some form of oppression. Now, people today might not literally shout, "Who is the Lord?" but they express the exact same sentiment when they treat their own autonomy as the highest possible law. Whenever prosperity is mistaken for immunity, or people honestly believe they can just redefine reality rather than submit to it, they are issuing a royal decree right from their own modern individual throne.
This timeline perfectly visualizes the source's great warning. A hard heart isn't something that forms instantly. It calcifies gradually over time through repeated incremental refusals to submit. It starts really small, just refusing an initial, quiet conviction. Then, maybe delaying an act of obedience for a few weeks. Later on, it morphs into actively justifying a moral compromise, and before you know it, the next refusal comes completely effortlessly. Pharaoh didn't become a monster overnight. Pride destroys individuals, it destroys homes, and it destroys institutions layer by layer, long before anyone is ever willing to admit it's happening.
And honestly, modern society constantly uses Pharaoh's exact playbook. Think about it. How often do people cry out for help in the middle of a crisis, only to completely postpone repentance the very second the pressure lifts? We constantly try to negotiate with commands instead of just obeying them. We gladly accept the portions of truth that comfort us while aggressively pushing back against the moral accountability that confronts us. Pharaoh tried to bargain with God to save face, and that deeply human tendency is still perfectly intact today.
The study reminds us of Hebrews 3:15, which issues a very clear, active command, "Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts." Now, if hardening were just something God arbitrarily forced onto innocent people, as some cosmic prank, this command wouldn't make any sense at all. Pharaoh stands as a living, breathing warning to us. You are in control of how you respond to truth, and you are fully accountable for the posture of your neck when you are reproved. So, we leave you with this final provocative thought from the explainer's case study to really carefully consider. No person and no society can reject truth indefinitely and remain morally unharmed. Pride still precedes destruction, reproof still demands a response from us, and truth still requires submission. The question isn't whether you will be confronted with evidence that challenges your personal autonomy. The question is, what will you do when that happens? Will your heart bow or will it break? Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next explainer.